Noah Holt was 22 years old when he bought a DNA test for a college biology assignment. He thought he was learning about genetics. What he actually discovered was that the man who adopted him had never adopted him at all. And the man who built that lie, the man who spent 22 years perfecting it inside the walls of a family home, inside a marriage, inside a life that looked, from every angle anyone could see, like exactly what it was supposed to be, was his father. In every biological, devastating, undeniable sense of the word. Stay with me. Because this story does not end where you think it ends. And the person in this who will surprise you most is not Richard, the father who carried the secret. It is not even Noah, the son who uncovered it. It is Carol, the woman who was deceived, the woman who was used, the woman who every single person watching this right now is already furious on behalf of. Carol Holt has a secret of her own. And when you hear what it is, and how long she kept it, and why she chose to keep it, I want you to think very carefully before you decide who the real villain of this story is. Because in 22 years of buried truth, the answer is not the one you are expecting. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, we would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one, stories about the hidden lives people build inside the lives they show the world, are what we do here at Hidden Intent Stories. Every week, another family that looked one way from the outside and was something entirely different on the inside. If that is the kind of story that stays with you long after you finish watching, you are exactly where you need to be. Now, let us talk about who these people actually were before everything fell apart. Because the single greatest mistake you can make when you hear a story like this one is to assume that the people inside it are simple. That the man who did what Richard Holt did must have been a certain kind of person from the very beginning. That the woman who was deceived the way Carol Holt was deceived must have been blind, or weak, or somehow complicit in what she did not yet know. People are not simple. And this story, drawn from documented accounts of real families torn open by DNA tests, private adoptions, and decades of buried secrets, with names and identifying details changed to protect those involved, is not simple either. The shape of it is real. The emotional weight of it is real. And every decision at the center of it was made by people who believed, at the moment they made it, that they were doing the right thing. That is what makes it so hard to look away. Richard Holt was born in 1963 in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 sons in a family that valued appearances above almost everything else. His father was a mid-level manager at an auto parts company who wore a tie to dinner on weekdays and believed, sincerely and without irony, that a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. Richard absorbed that lesson early and carried it with him all the way through Ohio State, all the way through law school, all the way into a career as a corporate attorney in Columbus where he was known, universally, as the most composed person in any room he occupied. He was not dishonest, exactly. He was selective. He understood, at a level he could not have articulated but absolutely felt in his body, that the right information placed in the right hands at the right moment was a form of power. And Richard Holt had spent his entire adult life organizing his world around that understanding. He met Carol Simmons in 1991 at a firm holiday party in Columbus. She was a third-grade teacher at an elementary school on the east side of the city, and she had come to the party as the plus one of a colleague who had long since disappeared into the crowd, leaving Carol standing near the drinks table with a glass of white wine and the particular expression of someone who is perfectly comfortable being alone but would not object to a conversation. Richard was the one who walked over. He would tell people for years afterward that she was the most genuinely warm person he had ever spoken to, and he meant it completely and sincerely, which is what makes what he eventually did to her so difficult to hold in your mind without wanting to put it down. They were married in June of 1993. And from the very first year of their marriage, they both wanted children. What they got instead was 4 years of trying. 4 years that Carol would later describe, in the only interview she ever gave about this period of her life, as the loneliest experience she had ever had. Not because Richard was absent. But because grief like that, the grief of a body that will not do what you need it to do, month after month after month, is a grief that lives inside you in a way that cannot be fully shared with another person, no matter how close they are to you. Carol went through 2 rounds of IVF. She had one pregnancy that ended at 11 weeks. She had a second that ended at 7. By 1997, her doctor was recommending they consider adoption, and Carol had begun, quietly and without telling Richard, to grieve the idea of a biological child the way you grieve someone you loved who is simply not coming back. She put a box of baby clothes in the attic. She stopped reading the parenting magazines she had been quietly collecting for 2 years. She decided she would learn to be okay. Richard watched all of this happen. He watched his wife carry a grief that he did not fully know how to reach, and he told himself he was being supportive by not pushing, by giving her space, by being the steady presence at the edge of her pain. What he was actually doing, and this is the part of Richard Holt that is genuinely hard to look at directly, was conducting an affair with a woman named Dana in the legal department of a client firm he worked with regularly. The affair began in the spring of 1997. It lasted 11 weeks. Richard ended it with the kind of clean efficiency he brought to most problems in his professional life. He arranged a meeting. He sat across from Dana in a conference room, not a restaurant, not somewhere personal, a conference room, and told her it was over, that he valued the working relationship, and that he hoped they could be professional going forward. Dana was 28 years old. She said fine. She went home. And 6 weeks later, she called him. She was pregnant. She had confirmed it with 2 separate tests. She was not calling to make demands or to threaten him. She was calling because she was alone and she was frightened and she did not know what else to do. Richard Holt took that phone call in the parking garage beneath his office building on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1997, and he stood next to his car for 11 minutes after it ended without moving. This is the moment, this parking garage, this particular Tuesday, that everything which came after was born from. Every subsequent decision. Every subsequent deception. Every ordinary Tuesday morning of Noah Holt's childhood, from the day he came home as an infant to the day he sat in front of a laptop and watched a web page change his life. It all traces back to 11 minutes of a man standing perfectly still, deciding what kind of person he was going to be. Richard Holt decided he was going to be a man who handled things. And then he went back upstairs to finish his 2 o'clock meeting. He met with Dana 3 times over the following 2 weeks. He was not cruel. He was not threatening. He presented her with a situation and a proposed resolution the way he would have presented a client with a legal strategy, with the same calm, the same measured voice, the same quality of control that had made him successful in every professional arena he had ever entered. He told her that if she chose to continue the pregnancy, he would make certain the child was cared for, not through ongoing support payments that would create a paper trail and a public record, but through a private arrangement with a family attorney he trusted. He told her the child would be placed with a family that wanted a child very much. He told her she would receive financial support for her medical care and for a period of time afterward. He told her the child would have a good life. Dana was a paralegal. She understood what private adoptions were. She understood what he was describing. And she was alone, and she was frightened, and the man across from her was calm in a way that made the thing he was proposing sound almost reasonable. She agreed. She would say much later, in a letter that would itself become the center of a second, entirely separate chapter of this story, that she agreed because she believed Richard when he said the child would be loved. That was the thing she held on to in the years that followed. She was not equipped, at 28 and alone and terrified, to raise a child on her own. She wanted the child to be loved. Richard told her the child would be loved. She signed the paperwork his attorney prepared. She gave birth to a boy in the spring of 1998, in a hospital in Cincinnati, far enough from Columbus that no one who knew Richard would see her. She held the baby for 2 hours. Then she handed him to a nurse. Then she drove home alone. She would not see Noah again for 7 years. Richard had told Carol about the adoption possibility 3 weeks before the birth. He framed it carefully, the way he framed everything. An attorney he knew professionally had a client, a young woman, a difficult situation, no family support system. The child would need a home. Would Carol be open to hearing more? Carol had been at the kitchen table grading papers when he said it. She put her red pen down. She looked at her husband. And she said, and she would remember this exact sentence for the rest of her life, she said, "Are you serious right now, Richard? Are you actually serious?" And Richard said yes. And Carol put both hands over her mouth and started to cry. She cried for a long time. And Richard sat across the table and watched, and said nothing about the parking garage, and nothing about Dana, and nothing about the fact that the child they were discussing was his. Noah James Holt came home in June of 1998. He was 3 months old. He had dark hair and Richard's exact jawline, which was a fact that Carol would later say she had registered and then simply filed away under the category of things that did not require explanation, because coincidences like that happen and you do not walk into the first day of parenthood with your defenses up looking for evidence. You walk in exhausted and overwhelmed and so completely flooded with love that your capacity for critical analysis is essentially switched off. Carol walked in holding a 3-month-old boy and crying and telling him that he was finally home. She had been waiting for him without knowing she was waiting. She meant every single word of that. Richard stood in the doorway of the nursery that evening and watched his wife fall in love with his son, his biological son, and told himself something he would spend years trying to untell himself. He told himself he had done something good. That this arrangement, this terrible, deliberately constructed, fundamentally dishonest arrangement, had produced something genuinely beautiful. He was not entirely wrong. That is the thing about Richard Holt that refuses to resolve into something clean. The love in that house was real. Noah was not raised in a cold or distant household. He was raised by a woman who gave him everything she had, and by a man who, whatever his catastrophic failures as a husband, showed up as a father with a consistency and devotion that Noah would not be able to simply dismiss even after he learned the truth. Richard coached Little League for 4 seasons. He sat through every school concert and every mediocre science fair project with the particular intensity of a parent who is also, in some private chamber of himself, aware that he owes this child something that presence alone can never fully repay. He was paying a debt he was not allowed to acknowledge. Noah grew up knowing he was adopted the same way that some kids grow up knowing they are left-handed. It was simply a fact of his life, woven into his story from so early that it carried no particular weight in either direction. Carol had handled it exactly the way child development experts recommend, openly, without drama, without secrecy. When Noah was 5, she told him that some families are made one way and some families are made another, and that their family was made with a great deal of love and a great deal of wanting. When he was 9, he went through a brief period of curiosity about his biological mother. Carol answered every question she could, which was not many, because the information Richard had provided her about Dana was minimal by design. When he was 14, he went through a brief period of anger that Carol recognized immediately as having nothing to do with adoption and everything to do with being 14. And then he went to high school, and he was good at it, and he was quiet in the way that perceptive people often are, and the question of his origins settled into the background of his life where it had always lived. He was 22 years old when it came back. He was in his second year of pre-med at Ohio State, and his genetics professor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wallace who had the specific, almost contagious enthusiasm for her subject that makes certain teachers genuinely dangerous to your assumptions about the world, had assigned a project requiring students to use a commercial DNA testing service to map their hereditary health markers and trace their ethnic ancestry. It was a practical exercise, Dr. Wallace explained. Understanding how to read and interpret genetic data was a foundational skill for anyone going into medicine. Noah ordered a 23andMe kit on a Tuesday. He mailed it back on Thursday. He forgot about it almost entirely for 3 weeks because he had an organic chemistry exam, a gross anatomy lab practical, and a part-time job at the university library that together consumed most of his available mental energy. The email arrived on a Friday evening in October. The subject line read, "Your DNA results are ready." Noah was at his desk in his apartment near campus, eating leftover pasta, studying a diagram of the brachial plexus. He almost did not open it that night. He was tired, and the results were for an assignment he had a full week to complete, and the pasta was still warm. But there was something he would describe later as a feeling like standing at the edge of a diving board you did not know was there, a low-level alertness he could not explain and would not understand until afterward, and he clicked the link. The results loaded. Ethnicity breakdown. Health markers. And then, at the bottom of the page, under a section labeled DNA relatives, a single entry at the top of the list. Categorized not as a distant cousin or a second-degree relative. Categorized as close family. 49.9% shared DNA. The name attached to that result was Richard Holt. Noah sat very still for a long time. He was a pre-med student in the middle of a genetics unit. He did not need to search what 49.9% shared DNA between two people meant. He knew exactly what it meant. It meant parent and child. It meant that the man who had stood in a Franklin County courtroom in 1998 and signed adoption paperwork for a 3-month-old infant named Noah was not adopting a stranger. He was, in every biological and genetic sense of the word, adopting his own son. Noah closed the laptop. He opened it again. He closed it again. He sat in the dark of his apartment for close to an hour, during which time he did not call anyone, did not text anyone, did not do anything except sit inside the specific quality of silence that arrives when the story you have believed your whole life about who you are turns out to have been written by someone else. He did not panic. This is one of the things about Noah Holt that everyone who knew him would have recognized immediately. He processed inward before he processed outward. He gathered information before he drew conclusions. He needed to understand something fully before he was willing to be visibly angry about it. These were traits he had always attributed, with a quiet, mild sense of recognition, to his father's influence. Richard Holt was exactly the same way. Controlled. Methodical. Careful with what he showed and when he showed it. Noah had grown up watching his father move through the world with that quality and had absorbed it so completely it had come to feel like his own. The night he found out that Richard was his biological father, Noah handled the news with exactly the calm and deliberate steadiness that Richard had modeled for him across an entire childhood. He would find this fact, later, almost unbearably funny. He spent 2 weeks investigating before he said a single word to anyone. He searched public records. He found a reference to a private adoption filing from June of 1998 in Franklin County, Ohio, sealed, but containing the name of the attorney who had handled the paperwork. He searched that attorney's professional history and found that he had worked extensively with Richard's firm throughout the late 90s. He searched Richard's name alongside the city of Cincinnati, where Noah's original birth certificate listed his birth hospital, and found nothing that directly connected them. But he also searched for Dana. He did not have Dana's last name initially, but the 23andMe account was registered under a name he was able to trace, through a combination of LinkedIn and an archived social media profile from the early internet years, to a woman who had worked as a paralegal at a Columbus firm that Richard's office had done significant business with in 1996 and 1997. He found a photograph. It was in an old MySpace archive. This was the early internet's particular and unintended gift to the people it had been used to deceive, a photograph from what appeared to be a professional social event, dated 1997. Richard Holt was in it. He was standing near a woman Noah had never seen before. They were not touching. They were not even particularly close together. But Richard's body was angled toward hers in the way that a body angles toward someone you know better than your professional relationship publicly suggests. Noah printed the photograph. He added it to the folder he had been building for 2 weeks, the DNA results, the adoption filing reference, the attorney connection, the overlapping timeline. He had the full picture. Or close enough to it. And then he did something that Richard, in all his years of running quiet mental contingency scenarios, had somehow never fully planned for. Noah did not call Richard. He called Carol. Carol Holt was at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning when her phone rang. She was grading papers. She still taught third grade at the same school on the east side of Columbus where she had spent most of her adult life, still with the particular devotion of someone who had long ago decided that the education of other people's children was as important as anything else she would ever do with her time. She looked at the caller ID. Noah. She smiled. She answered. And within the first 10 seconds of that conversation, something settled in Carol's chest, not panic, not surprise, but the particular stillness of a building that finally accepts the weight it has been holding. Noah's voice was too careful. Too controlled. She had been reading that voice for 22 years. She knew, before he said a single word about DNA or adoption or biology, that whatever he was about to tell her was something he had been preparing to say for longer than this phone call had been ringing. He told her everything. The DNA results. The 49.9%. The attorney. The archived photograph. He told her calmly and in order, with the precision of someone who has not rehearsed the words but has absolutely rehearsed the steadiness. He told her he was not calling to make accusations. He told her he just needed to know if she knew. He said it exactly like that, "Mom, I just need to know if you knew." And Carol Holt sat at her kitchen table with her red pen in her hand and a stack of third-grade math worksheets in front of her, and she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "Noah. I know. I have known for a long time. And I think it is time for the three of us to sit down together." Noah's hand tightened around the phone. His mother's voice was steady. Not surprised. Not shattered. Steady, in the way of someone who has had a long time to make peace with something that has not gone anywhere. "How long?" he asked her. She said, 7 years. 7 years she had known. Noah was 15 years old when Carol Holt found out the full truth about her adopted son. And she had kept it to herself for 7 more years, through his junior year of high school, through his senior year, through his high school graduation and his first year of college and his second year of college, and every holiday and birthday and ordinary Sunday morning at the family table. She had kept it completely, perfectly, silently to herself. Noah asked her how she had found out. She told him there was a letter. She said she would explain everything when they were in the same room. She said she was going to call Richard right now and tell him to come home that weekend. She said, "We are going to sit down together, the three of us, and your father is going to tell you the truth, and then I am going to tell you what I know, and we are going to do this the way this family is going to start doing things from now on. By telling the actual truth." Finally. Noah said okay. He hung up. He sat in his apartment and understood, for the first time, that the story he had been investigating was much older and much more complicated than the 2 weeks he had spent building his folder. Richard Holt received Carol's phone call later that same Saturday morning. He was at the office. He worked most Saturdays, had for 30 years, the kind of professional habit that is also, at some level, a kind of absence from things you do not fully want to be present for. When Carol told him what Noah had found, and told him that she had confirmed to Noah that she knew, and told him she needed Richard home that weekend for a conversation that was long overdue, Richard sat down in his office chair and was quiet for close to 20 seconds. Carol waited. She had spent 22 years waiting for Richard to fill silences he was responsible for creating. She was done with that particular patience. She said, "Richard. I need you to come home. This weekend." He said yes. He was there by Friday evening. He sat in the living room of the house where they had raised their son and looked at the photographs on the mantel, Noah at his Little League championship game, Noah at prom with a girl whose name Richard could still not remember, Noah in his Ohio State sweatshirt on the first day of his freshman year, and he did something that, for Richard Holt, was genuinely unprecedented. He did not plan. He did not strategize. He did not spend the evening constructing a version of events that could be carefully managed and presented at an angle that made him look better than he was. He sat with what was coming. He let it be as large as it actually was. And for the first time in 22 years, that quality of stillness that had always read to other people as composure felt, to Richard himself, like something closer to surrender. Noah drove up from Columbus on Saturday morning. He arrived just before 11. He walked through the front door of the house he had grown up in, the house where he had done his homework and learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway and come home from his first date at 10:30 with the particular expression of a teenager who does not want to be read, and he found both of his parents already seated at the kitchen table. He sat down across from them. Nobody spoke for a long moment. And then Noah reached into the folder he had brought with him and placed the printed DNA results on the table. He set them down quietly, face up, directly between his parents. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Richard looked at the paper. He looked at his son. He looked at Carol, who was looking at her own hands. And then Richard Holt, the most composed person in every room he had occupied for the past 30 years, put his face in both of his hands. He did not try to explain it away. He did not offer the carefully prepared version he had rehearsed and discarded at various quiet moments over 2 decades. He told the truth. He told it slowly and in order, the way you tell a truth that you have been carrying for a very long time when you finally set it down, not with relief, exactly, but with the specific exhaustion of something heavy leaving your body for good. He told Noah about Dana. He told him about the affair, about the phone call in the parking garage, about the 3 meetings, about the attorney and the arrangement and the financial settlement. He told him about standing in a hospital corridor watching a nurse carry a 3-month-old infant toward a woman who believed she was receiving the greatest gift of her life. He told him about the years that came after, the baseball and the homework and the emergency room visits and the ordinary evenings at the dinner table, and how he had maintained the secret not because he was indifferent to the damage it might eventually do but because he had told himself, from the very beginning, that the damage of knowing would be worse than the damage of not knowing. He had believed that, he said. He had believed it the entire time. And then Richard said the sentence that Carol had been waiting, without fully knowing she was waiting, to hear him say out loud in front of his son. He said, "I thought you would never be able to handle knowing the truth." He was looking at Carol when he said it. It was framed as an explanation. It may have been intended, somewhere beneath the framing, as a form of apology. What it actually was, in the way that beliefs people have never examined have a way of revealing themselves when they are finally spoken, was a confession of something deeper than the affair and deeper than the adoption and deeper than 22 years of sustained, deliberate deception. It was a confession of how Richard Holt had seen his wife. Not as a partner. Not as someone with an equal claim to the truth of their shared life. But as someone to be managed. Protected, in the particular way that controlling people protect the people around them, by deciding for them, unilaterally and without consultation, what they are strong enough to know. Carol stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen doorway. She stood there with her back to both of them. She did not speak. Noah watched his mother stand in that doorway and understood something about her that he had not fully understood before that moment. He had always known Carol was strong. He had always known she was the more emotionally present of his 2 parents, the one who saw him most clearly, the one he called first when something went wrong. What he was understanding now, watching her stand in that doorway with 22 years of someone else's deception in the room behind her and 7 years of her own carefully chosen silence in the room with her, was that his mother was not simply strong. She was, by every meaningful measure, the most composed person in that kitchen. She had been the most composed person in this story for a very long time. She turned around. She walked back to the table. And she set something on the surface between them. It was an envelope. It was the kind of old that paper becomes when it has been kept safe for years, handled and refolded and placed back carefully too many times to count. Noah looked at the envelope. Richard looked at the envelope. Carol sat back down, folded her hands on the table, and began to tell them about the letter. Dana Mercer had written to Carol in the fall of 2015. Noah was 15 years old. Dana had spent those years, 7 years after signing the adoption paperwork, 7 years of watching from a distance as the outline of her decision settled into the permanent shape of someone else's family, carrying something she had finally decided she could not carry alone any longer. She was not writing to reclaim Noah. She was not writing to threaten anyone or to blow up a family she had spent years watching from the outside with a grief that was also, in its way, a form of gratitude. She was writing because she was a woman who had made a decision under enormous pressure at 28 years old, and who had spent the 7 years since occasionally wondering whether the woman on the other side of that decision had ever been told the full truth about where her son actually came from. She wrote to Carol because she believed Carol deserved to know. Not necessarily what Richard had done, she did not know the specific way Richard had framed the adoption to Carol. She wrote to tell Carol who Noah's biological mother was. And in the process of telling Carol who she was, she told her everything else. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten. Carol had read it at the kitchen table, this same table where the three of them were sitting now, on an afternoon in November when Noah was at school and Richard was at work and the house was completely empty. She read it 3 times. She sat with it for what she would later estimate was almost 2 hours. And then she put it back in the envelope, walked to her bedroom closet, and placed it in a shoebox behind a stack of old tax returns. She went downstairs. She started dinner. That evening, Noah came home from school with a problem set he needed help with, and Carol sat with him at this same table and helped him work through it, and when Richard came home at 7 the food was already on the table and Carol did not look at him any differently than she had the day before. She did not say a word about the letter. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not for the next 7 years. Noah looked at his mother across the table and asked her the question that had been present in the room since she said those words on the phone a week ago. He asked her why. Why, for 7 years, had she said nothing? Carol took a long breath. She said, because you were 15. She said, because you were my son, and you were 15 years old, and you were happy, and you were doing well in school, and you had just made the JV basketball team, and the most important thing I could imagine was giving you the chance to just be 15. Not to be the child at the center of someone else's catastrophe. Just a 15-year-old kid living his life. She said she had decided, sitting at this table with that letter in her hands, that the truth was not going anywhere. That it would be there when Noah was old enough to hold it without being crushed by it. That her job, the job she had accepted the moment she held a 3-month-old boy and told him he was finally home, was to make sure he got to be a child for as long as childhood lasted. And then she looked directly at Richard and she said the sentence that Noah would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said, I did not keep this secret for you, Richard. I kept it for him. Richard sat across from his wife and heard those words land in the room and understood something he had spent 22 years being unable to understand. He had built his entire justification for what he had done on the belief that he was protecting people. That his silence was a form of love. That knowing would have been more damaging than not knowing, and that he, uniquely, unilaterally, by virtue of the information he alone possessed, had been the one to make that judgment and carry the cost of it. But what Carol had just described was not the same thing. Carol had discovered the truth fully formed, with all of its implications visible and undeniable, and had chosen, consciously, deliberately, with complete knowledge of what she was choosing to do and what she was choosing to give up, to wait. To protect her son. To carry the weight of knowing without allowing that weight to fall on a teenager who had done nothing to deserve it. Richard had constructed the situation and then presided over it for 2 decades and called his management of it protection. There is a difference between protecting someone and managing them. Richard Holt had spent his entire life being unable to see that difference. He was seeing it now, sitting at a kitchen table with his son and his wife, with an old envelope between them and nowhere left to look except at what he had actually done. Noah sat at the table for a long time after Carol finished speaking. He looked at the letter. He thought about the 15-year-old version of himself at this same table with a problem set, his mother's red pen moving across the page, and the 4 pages upstairs in a shoebox. He thought about every morning that had happened between that November and this Saturday, 7 years of his mother getting up and making breakfast and going to school and coming home and sitting across from Richard at dinner and carrying what she was carrying without letting any of it touch him. Not because she was passive. Not because she had been manipulated into staying. Because she had made a choice. A fully conscious, fully informed, irreversible adult choice to put her son first, every single day, for 7 years. He reached across the table and took her hand. He held it for a moment. And then he said, quietly, "I know, Mom. I know you did." Richard watched his son take his wife's hand, and something shifted in him in a way that he would spend the next several years trying to describe accurately to a therapist in a small office in downtown Columbus. He had walked into this kitchen believing, in some unexamined room of himself, that he was the central figure in this story. The man who had done the thing, hidden the thing, survived the thing, and who would now confess to the thing and thereby become, at least in some partial and imperfect way, the man who had finally told the truth. And sitting there watching Noah hold Carol's hand, watching her receive that from her son with the quiet steadiness of a person who has never needed rescuing, Richard understood something that no amount of professional success had ever required him to reckon with. He had been the least extraordinary person in this family for a very long time. Possibly for much longer than this kitchen. Possibly for most of his adult life. Richard and Carol separated 11 months after that Saturday morning. It was not a dramatic event. It was not a courtroom confrontation or a scene in a driveway. It was the quiet, mutual recognition of two people who had been living inside a structure that had never been built honestly, and who were both finally too tired and too honest to keep doing it. Carol moved to a smaller house on the west side of Columbus. Richard moved to an apartment downtown, close to the office. They were cordial with each other. They had a son they both loved, and neither of them was willing to turn that love into contested territory. They are not close now. But they are not strangers. They share a family, in the imperfect, careful, more graceful than you might expect way that families share things after the ground shifts permanently beneath them. Noah took a leave of absence from his pre-med program in the semester following that Saturday. He needed time, not to fall apart, because Noah was not that kind of person, but to sit with the full weight of what he had learned and let it settle into the new shape of who he was going to be. He spent part of that time in therapy. He spent part of it at Carol's new house on the west side, eating dinner at her table and helping her grade papers the way he had since he was old enough to hold a red pen. He reached out to Dana. He found her through the same LinkedIn profile he had used during his 2-week investigation. He sent her a message that took him 3 drafts and was, in the end, only 4 sentences long. He told her he knew who she was. He told her he wanted nothing from her. He told her he was glad she had written the letter to Carol. He asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee. Dana said yes. They met twice. They are not close. But they are not strangers either. Noah knows who his mother is, which is to say he knows Carol. He knows what Carol chose and what it cost her and what it gave him, and he also knows who Dana is, and he has made room in his understanding of himself for both of those truths without needing either of them to resolve into something simpler than they actually are. Richard, to the credit that genuinely belongs to him, did not spend the years after that Saturday trying to justify himself. He sold the family home. He started therapy for the first time in his 60 years. His therapist told him, and this is something Richard has since shared openly, in the conversations that formed the foundation of this story, that the central work of their time together would be learning to distinguish between protection and control. Between caring for someone and deciding for them what they are capable of knowing. Between love and management. Richard said that was the hardest work he had ever done. He also said it was the most necessary work of his life. He is still doing it. Noah returned to Ohio State the following year. He is finishing his pre-med degree now and applying to medical schools, an achievement that Carol speaks about with the particular, unguarded pride of a woman who has spent her entire professional life believing that other people's children can exceed every expectation anyone ever had for them. Richard speaks about it too, with a quieter version of the same pride. They are not in the same room when they speak about it. But they are both speaking about it. And Noah, who grew up inside a family built on a lie and also, genuinely, built on love, who became the person he is in a house full of secrets that were kept for reasons as different as the people who kept them. Noah is walking into his future carrying the full, complicated, imperfect truth of where he came from. Not the managed version. Not the version anyone constructed or protected or delivered in a careful envelope. The actual truth. He says it is heavier than not knowing. He also says it is better. There is a question this story leaves me with every time I turn it over in my mind, and I am going to leave it with you today. Not about Richard. What Richard did is not genuinely difficult to assess. He made a selfish decision in a parking garage, built an elaborate deception to protect it, and spent 22 years calling that deception love. That part is not the question. The question is about Carol. Carol, who found out the truth when Noah was 15 and chose to say nothing. Who sat across from her husband at dinner every night for 7 years, knowing what she knew, choosing again every morning to wait. Who was not passive and was not broken and was not naive, who was, by every meaningful measure, the most deliberate and intentional person in this entire story. Was what she did wisdom? Was it sacrifice? Was it the most loving thing a mother could have done, giving her son the gift of a childhood that was not overshadowed by someone else's catastrophe? Or was it its own form of deception? A different kind of secret, kept for different reasons, by a person with far better motives, but a secret nonetheless. I have thought about that question many times. I have not resolved it. I suspect you will not fully resolve it either. And I think that is exactly as it should be. Because the people in this story are not simple. And the love in this story, whatever else it was, whatever it cost, whatever it was built on, was never simple either. That is what Hidden Intent Stories is about. Not the version of people that is easy to judge. The version that is true. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, if it made you sit with something uncomfortable for a few minutes after it ended, if it made you think about a secret you are keeping or a truth someone has kept from you, that is exactly what we came here to do. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you believe Carol should have done when she read that letter. Tell us whether you think a man like Richard is capable of real change, or whether some patterns are too deeply built to be rebuilt. Tell us where you are watching from, because this community reaches further than we ever expected, and we love knowing where these stories are landing. If you are not yet subscribed to Hidden Intent Stories, hit that button now and turn on the notification bell. Every week, a new story about the lives people build in the dark, and what happens when someone finally turns the light on. Next time on Hidden Intent Stories, she was his boss for 6 years. She approved his annual performance reviews. She signed his promotions. She shook his hand at every Christmas party with the professional ease of someone who had a very good reason to keep her distance. What neither of them knew, what both of them were about to find out, was that she was also the woman who gave birth to his son. That story is coming. Make sure you are here for it.